George Burns was America's favorite comedian for 8 decades. He amassed an enormous wealth of more than $30 million. His 2 adopted children believed they would inherit everything. However, Burns took a choice in March 1996 that no one anticipated. He wrote his children entirely against his will. Every single dollar was spent somewhere else. There were only questions left for his family. According to friends, Burns kept several secrets from everyone. The shocking betrayal that occurred years ago is the true reason he left his children behind. Did your physician not tell you? Now George, you got my physician has passed away. On January 20, 1896, George Burns was born in a modest flat at 95 Pitt Street in the Lower East Side of New York. Nathan Birnbaum was his name, and everything around him was loud and quick at the time. Lewis's parents, Dora and Lewis, brought their old world ways into a small new world after fleeing difficulties in Ruptica, Galatia. He was the 10th of their 12 children. The family was crammed into 3 small rooms, where their bodies provided more warmth than blankets. Lewis was a canner who made just enough money to support the family. For the assistance of her neighbors, Dora cleaned clothing. The majority of children on the Lower East Side shared beds and wore second-hand clothing. On several nights, the only food served for supper was potatoes and onions. It felt like a gift, even bread. Nevertheless, George recalled the Yiddish jokes, the laughter and the cadence of those rooms. That sense of humor stuck with him. In 1904, everything was different. When his father unexpectedly passed away at the age of 47, he was 8. The family had neither a backup nor any funds. He had to assist, thus school ended for him after the 5th grade. He sold shoes for 5 cents each while he stood on street corners. Even though it was long, filthy and cold, he persisted. He occasionally received additional credit for his singing in the Imperial Five, a children's quartet. Their promoter stole their money one evening. George slept in alleyways because he had nowhere else to go and discovered what true hunger and terror felt like. However, he carried those evenings with him like covert instruction. He would employ the street smarts and tenacity they taught him throughout his life. His identity changed as he matured. His family referred to him as Natty because of his shine box. Other kids called him Shoes Birnbaum. He rolled cigars. He was a newspaper salesman. He sneaked into burlesque theaters to see entertainers fabricate laughter. That was the life he desired. He made a foolish wager in his early teens and attempted to swim across the East River. He nearly drowned as the current swept him beneath. He was terrified at the time, but it also made him feel crazy. He soon tried on various stage names. George Burns was descended from the Burns Brothers Coal Company and his brother Izzy George Birnbaum. Once, in order to keep his family warm, he had taken coal from them. Later on, he even used identities like Captain Betts and Willie Delight to trick booking agents and keep his job. He felt the need to run at the age of 14, and he did. He moved away from home in 1910 in the hopes of becoming a successful singer and joined the Mickey Rooney Stock Company. In a theater in the Midwest, he gave his first paid performance. However, the audience jeered him till coins fell on the stage and he froze, forgetting every word. He was immediately sacked. Although the humiliation was painful, he consistently claimed that it was the greatest lesson he had ever learned. Following that, he sang on street corners, in brothels, on ferry boats, and wherever else that could give him a little cash as he traveled the Midwest. He didn't eat much on certain days. Even though he didn't get much sleep on some nights, he continued to move and felt alive. He was still chasing the stage at the age of 17 in 1913. He joined sisters Beatrice and Irene to form the Burning Three, a singing duo. They visited challenging vaudeville venues with hostile audiences. George and Beatrice were left penniless after Irene abruptly left with a sailor. George returned to New York with a heavy ego and empty money after pleading for a train ticket home. But he never considered giving up. During those years he learned how to improvise, deal with dubious theater owners who wouldn't pay, and endure the pain of failure without losing his passion. He attempted to enlist in the Navy when World War I broke out, but they turned him down because he was too short. They preferred taller males, and he was 5'7". He took a different path rather than quitting up. He sneaked into groups of entertainers on troop ships while posing as a woman named Barbara. It was dangerous. A single error might have resulted in his imprisonment, but he managed to avoid it. He prayed he wouldn't be found while singing for soldiers who were homesick. At the moment, it was only survival, but later, he chuckled about it. He was often saved by reinvention. When he partnered with ballerina Elsie Lerner in 1916, he believed he had discovered his calling. They performed all across the East Coast as a ballroom act. Elsie, however, left him for a more affluent man. George found himself trapped once more. He accepted a job as a soda jerk on the boardwalk at Coney Island because he was broke and exhausted. He practiced jokes on patrons while serving ice cream. While some laughed, others turned to leave. They all gave him timing lessons. He developed his ability to read people and make quick adjustments. Later on, he made a joke about how this job helped his career more than any producer had. As 1920, he was performing on his own and going as George Burns full-time. During Prohibition, he worked at speakeasies where raids may occur at any time. He was captured one night and forced to hide in a coal bin. He was covered in black soot, embarrassed yet oddly empowered when he climbed out. He realized after several evenings that he required a stage partner to keep him balanced. He required a companion who could keep up with his beat. In 1923, that partner made an appearance. In a booking office in Chicago, he met Gracie Allen. When dancer Maggie Healy forgot her lines during their audition, he fired her out of irritation. He later ran upon Gracie, a 27-year-old Irish-American entertainer whose family business had failed. Even though their initial encounter was straightforward, he sensed something new about her. Would she like to try his performance? He asked. George was going to play the humorous role while she played straight throughout their rehearsal. However, everything changed when they appeared in front of a throng. People made fun of Gracie's naive perplexity. Her timing, voice, and fast responses drew everyone's attention to her. George modified the performance overnight after seeing it right away. He became the patient observer who allowed Gracie to shine, and she became the oddball character. The magnetism was evident in their first performance together at New York's Hill Street Theater. They were adored by the audience. Waves of laughter rolled. They learned what worked and what didn't from that early routine known as 6040. According to George, Gracie and the audience had a connection that he would never be able to match. They joined the popular circuit in 1924 and developed successes like their lamb chops and dizzy acts. They purchased their first car after earning $50 a week. At last, life seemed to be opening up. By the end of 1925, George experienced an unpleasant apprehension. Gracie was being courted by another performer. He told her she had to make a decision on Christmas Eve. Get married to him or leave. Gracie agreed, albeit it was audacious and untidy. On January 7, 1926, they tied the knot in Cleveland. Although the event was brief, it had a significant impact. From that point on, their personal and professional lives became intertwined. A few weeks later, they agreed to a 6-year deal with RKO, which stipulated that neither of them could perform alone. They were forced into a decades-long partnership as a result. Although stability was guaranteed by the contract, life presented fresh challenges. During rehearsals, Gracie started passing out. Later, doctors determined that it was a heart ailment that would accompany her for the rest of her life. George had no idea that someone so vibrant could be so frail. Still, she continued to perform. She endured years of suffering and fatigue, winning the respect of everyone in her vicinity. She eventually had to quit in 1958, due to that ailment, which ultimately caused her death in 1964. However, she carried the show on her shoulders during their ascent with a strength that the crowd was blind to. Something changed for George Burns and Gracie Allen when they took the stage at the Palace Theater in New York in 1927. A vaudeville act could only perform at the Palace, and it seemed like the ideal they had been pursuing for years was finally coming true when they performed there as the main act, earning $1.50 each week. The audiences adored them, particularly Gracie's bizarre, illogical logic that consistently landed. The laughter from those evenings followed them everywhere they went, and critics likened them to the Marx Brothers. From the outside, their ascent appeared quick, but behind it were years of hardship, role switching, and realizing that Gracie was the real spark who lit up the room with a series of perplexed questions. The Palace forced them into the next phase of their ascent and secured their position as a top act. They traveled across the ocean for a 15-week BBC radio tour 2 years later, in 1929. Although everything was intended to go smoothly, British customs confiscated George's cigars as soon as they arrived. He had been smoking since he was 10 years old, and now he had nothing to ease his anxiety. He therefore incorporated the annoyance into their performance by turning it into jokes about withdrawal. The audience in Britain adored it. By cramming broadcast hours and maintaining high wages, their habits spread over a continent that did not know them. They were well known throughout the world as a result of that tour, which also demonstrated how, with the correct handling, various laws, customs and behaviors could be made humorous. They were large enough for the Ziegfeld Follies, one of America's most glitzy productions, by 1931. They shared the stage with performers such as Eddie Cantor. However, Gracie found the journey to be draining. Because she detested flying, rail travel between cities became an interminable ordeal. She twisted her ankle in the middle of a performance. Despite the excruciating pain, George lifted her and carried her to the stage, where she continued to act as if no one else was watching. They were followed by another narrative evidence of their close relationship and regard for the audience that occupied every seat. George was performing something that few entertainers dared at the same time. He utilized their theater earnings to covertly purchase repossessed real estate during the 1929 crash, while others squandered their money on upscale hotels and clothing. As the nation worried, he was purchasing properties for pennies. These investments kept theaters solvent when the Great Depression struck and they had to close. Many performers had nothing, but George had anticipated the industry's upheaval and ensured they wouldn't perish. In 1930, they made their cinematic debut with Paramount shorts like Lamb Chops. But there was a twist to even that moment. George's eyebrows were burned and smoke filled the room when the reel jammed and the projector exploded during one screening. Rather than fleeing, he immediately made light of the mishap by joking about the explosion as though it had been planned. Executives were in disbelief. They had just witnessed someone quickly transform dread into fun. And more doors were opened by such rapid thinking than by any rehearsed remark. On February 15, 1932, the George Burns and Gracie Allen show debuted on NBC, marking their radio breakthrough. Each 15-minute episode focused on Gracie's bizarre miscommunications, which ultimately led to a solution. Nearly 40 million people watched every week by the middle of the 1930s. At a time when most performances did barely achieve half that attendance, that figure was practically unbelievable. The approach was free-form, somewhat spontaneous, and unexpected. Real laughing, genuine perplexity, and genuine sparks between them were audible to the audience. Within a year, ratings increased by more than 60%, from 19.3 to 31.3. They had demonstrated that radio could function without strict scripts. All it took were two people who knew how to play off each other, rhythm and honesty. Then, as part of a lengthy comedic routine, Gracie conducted a fictitious presidential campaign in 1933. It was dubbed the Surprise Party by her. She even printed ballots while touring 39 states. During the actual 1940 election, several voters really typed her name in, which perplexed local officials until they discovered it was all a ruse. She pledged to tax only the appropriate clouds and intended to hire friends who wore fine clothes for cabinet positions. The tagline was "It's in the bag," and the mascot was a kangaroo. Their radio ratings increased by about 40% as a result of the campaign, and news organizations began to wonder how well politics and entertainment might coexist. Although it was a jest, it served as a mirror for the nation. Their collaboration continued to surprise people even in the background. Although George wrote almost all of the scripts, he consistently claimed that Gracie was the driving force behind them. He wanted the public to notice her talent in a time when males typically grabbed all the glory. Gracie made a joke about forgetting she was married to George in an episode from 1935. Fans believed it to be genuine. George was accused of mistreating her in thousands of letters that flooded in. To dispel the misunderstanding and declare that their marriage was solid, he had to appear on live radio. Rather than harming them, the incident resulted in a 20% increase in their ratings. People cherished the sense of realism in their fiction. When they switched to CBS in 1934 for $10,000 a week, that was the next significant development. That payment seemed absurd at a period when the majority of Americans earned less than $2,000 annually. When Gracie had an emergency appendectomy in 1937, in particular, they began incorporating real-life situations into their show. They even included actual doctors in the program and made her surgery a plot point. Everyone was captivated by the blend of humor and reality, which altered the way radio writers approached narrative. It gave the audience a sense of intimacy, as though they were a member of the family. They were so successful by 1938 that they purchased a Beverly Hills house. It ought to have been a tranquil prize. However, George left a lit cigar on a table one evening. The cigar ignited a fire that spread more quickly than anyone anticipated, rolled and burnt through fabric. The house was just barely saved. The story was a huge hit with newspapers. Rather than concealing the scare, they turned it into an episode titled The House That Burns Built. In the script, Gracie placed the blame on herself and turned the catastrophe into humor that further endeared them. Their charm was derived from their capacity to laugh at their own errors. For them, Hollywood was also a significant phase. Their huge broadcast in 1932, where their duet, Love and Bloom, made them national celebrities, marked the beginning of their foray into the film industry. However, censorship issues continued to plague them. Executives at the studio felt that Gracie's dizzy jokes sounded too provocative and required rewrites. During filming, George would subtly reintroduce the original phrases as ad-libs. Although it was a light-hearted rebellion, it influenced comics' subsequent defiance of rigid studio regulations. When the flimsy wire used for Gracie's chandelier stunt broke in 1933, she was plummeted roughly 10 feet and almost harmed at International House. George caught her as he was directly beneath her, breaking 2 ribs in the process. They continued to perform, laughing as though the fall had been a part of the show. Uncertain of whether to ask for assistance or continue filming, the cameramen stood motionless. That scene was used in the movie, transforming a near-tragic event into a timeless comedic classic. They collaborated with Fred on a design on a damsel in distress in 1937. Gracie blurted out that she was lost in London during a crucial scene when she became frightened and forgot her dance moves. There was no pause in a look. The entire set laughed as he danced around her bewilderment and transformed it into an impromptu act. Later on, he referred to it as pure magic. It demonstrated how swift wit might transform mishaps into memorable events. They raised spirits in the camps by performing for the troops in 1941 during WWAN. However, Gracie became embroiled in an odd scandal. She snuck a few pairs of silk stockings to give as gifts because they were in short supply during the war. It was considered contraband by the authorities. She nearly ran into a court-martial before George pulled all of his strings. After that, the soldiers adored her even more. It turned into one of those untold tales that showed off her courage. They were at the top by 1945. 2 Girls and a Sailor, their movie, made almost $4 million. However, Gracie's health started to deteriorate. She had to take a 6-month leave of absence due to severe migraines. George started writing his autobiographical manuscript in secret during her break. He wished to keep their story intact, particularly the intimate details that only they were aware of. Later, that draft was turned into the love story Gracie. Fans will never forget how it encapsulated the essence of their collaboration. Something new softly crept into American living rooms on October 12, 1950. When the George Burns and Gracie Allen show debuted on CBS, nobody could have predicted that this small sitcom would revolutionize television. At a period when the majority of shows were still created from tape segments or radio scraps, it was hazardous to go live with a studio audience. However, people were drawn in as if George were sitting next to them as soon as he left a scene and began speaking directly to the audience. The show quickly gained popularity. At its height, it pulled in close to $200,000 per season and ran for 291 episodes until 1958. They pretended that it was a glimpse into their actual lives by playing themselves in a straightforward home environment. This decision paved the way for the explosion of family comedy that dominated the 1950s and influenced all subsequent developments. Then in November 1951, came episode 47. The arrangement was charming and straightforward. Gracie's old campaign activities from the 1930s were connected to George's surprise birthday celebration. However, a prop cake that blew up too soon was the true surprise. Frosting shot all over the place. After a brief moment of silence, the cast started laughing heartily. The producers broadcast everything live. Hearing the shock in the studio, everyone at home enjoyed every moment of it. Because there was no safety net in early television, mishaps like this one added to its allure. One of the most talked about scenes of the decade was that messy moment. However, the on-screen humor concealed a personal injury. George acknowledged having a one-night affair while on tour in the early 1950s. He was devastated by the guilt. He bought Gracie a $750 silver centerpiece and a $10,000 diamond ring as a gesture of reconciliation. She said nothing. She never went up to him. The world thought they were flawless for decades. Only years later in his memoirs did the truth come to light. And Gracie's humor was present despite that anguish. She once expressed her desire for George to cheat once more to Mary Livingstone, Jack Benny's wife, saying that she needed another focal point. A hidden world of sorrow, forgiveness, and complex love lurked behind the glamour of their TV marriage. Gracie began to wane as the decade progressed. It wasn't until the 1950s that the severity of her untreated cardiac issues became apparent. Even though she had had them from childhood, she became too ill to continue filming by 1957. George informed the audience she was on vacation, but he kept the truth to himself. She persevered through angina attacks and even gave a performance despite fracturing her nose, but she was unable to continue indefinitely. She resigned in 1958 and passed away from a heart attack at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles on August 27, 1964. With her departure, a television chapter that had influenced a whole age came to an end. Jack Benny appeared as a guest while their show was still airing in 1956. The sight of two giants together delighted fans. However, at the age of 60, George injured his hip after tripping over a cable behind the scenes. He spent the remainder of the season filming while seated because he would not give up. He then joked that the injury was a little price to pay for comedy, turning it into another aspect of his legend. Even when his bones bowed, his spirit remained unwavering. He was devastated on the day Gracie passed away. She passed away on August 27, 1964, at the age of 69, and George nearly passed out during her funeral. Later on, he said that he had only ever shed tears twice in his life, once for Gracie and once for his mother. He continued to perform live with an empty chair on stage for the next 2 years. He would face it, give her lines, and inform the crowd that she was only off stage. People shared his tears. Long after she was gone, the empty chair came to represent the affection he had for her. However, life continued on. He tried a new program called Wendy and Me in 1965. In his role, he spied on his tenants as a landlord. It landed poorly. The show lacked the flair that Gracie brought. ABC discontinued it after just 1 season. George questioned whether his career had finished at age 69. After a lifetime of working as a partnership, he rebuilt from scratch, returned to nightclub tours, and discovered what it was like to work alone. He reached a breaking point in 1967. He smoked constantly and drank excessively. He passed out on stage during a Las Vegas stint due to tiredness. Doctors warned him that if he didn't quit, he wouldn't make it through the year. Overnight, he gave up everything. No smokes, no drink, and no convenient crutch. He later said that the decision saved his life and turned into a pivotal moment that sustained him for decades. He made another attempt with a grandfather for Christmas specials in 1969. Fans continued to repeat the same thing, despite his hopes that they would serve as a reminder of his identity. The old banter was what they desired. The cigar was what they desired. They desired Gracie's cadence. George started performing with guests like Carol Channing after realizing he needed another foil. The audience gradually warmed up once more. He gradually discovered himself. His autobiography, I Love Her, That's Why, was released in 1968. Over 100,000 copies were sold. With nuances like Gracie forgetting where she parked her car, it blended humor and honesty. His first solo tour was financed by the success. It served as a springboard for a new profession and gave him his first taste of self-expression. One of the biggest shocks of his life then occurred. He co-starred with Walter Matthau as Al Lewis in The Sunshine Boys in 1975. When the movie debuted in December 1975, it was immediately praised. At the age of 80, he won Best Supporting Actor at the 48th Academy Awards on March 29, 1976. He defeated younger celebrities such as Jaws' Richard Dreyfuss. Hollywood gasped. He became a living legend overnight after his victory. He co-starred with John Denver in Oh God the next year. The movie became one of 1977's biggest hits, earning over $51 million. George used the same gentle bite that made him renowned when delivering his words. Additionally, he included a provision allowing him to smoke cigars on set in his contract. He started smoking when he was 14 years old, and he frequently smoked 10 to 15 cigars every day. His late-life image was molded by the film, which delighted audiences with its depiction of a witty god smoking a cigar. He signed a 5-year contract with Caesars World in Las Vegas in November 1983 when he was 87. On his 100th birthday, he pledged to put on a special performance. Although he played sold-out gigs far into his 90s, executives made jokes about wagering against him living that long. He even made a joke about how Julius owned Caesar's Palace the last time he performed there. He was characterized by that contract as someone who consistently maintained both himself and the joke. At the age of 88, he underwent triple bypass surgery in 1984. For a year, most individuals would vanish. In a matter of months, he was back filming "Oh God, You Devil," frequently using a wheelchair. He concealed it from the camera and put all of his youthful enthusiasm into each sentence. Everyone in his vicinity was motivated by his tenacity. He was honored by the Kennedy Center in 1988 at the age of 92. That evening, he and B. Midler performed a duet. He combined his voice with her archival recordings for the Grammy-winning album Gracie, which was published later that year. When they were heard together again, fans sobbed. Time continued to take its toll, but it seemed as though he had reached through time to clasp her hand once more. At the age of 98, he slipped in his bathtub in Beverly Hills in July 1994. He severely cut his head after hitting a soap dish. Doctors at Cedars-Sinai observed that he was slurring his words. In order to remove fluid from his brain, they had to do emergency surgery. His eagerly anticipated Caesar's Palace performance, which had sold out almost a year earlier, had to be cancelled. After that collapse, his health never fully recovered, and after more than 80 years, his performance career came to an end. Even from his hospital bed, he continued to make people laugh. To feel alive, he continued to dictate fresh lines and delivered jokes to friends like Milton Berle. Because he was too frail to celebrate his formal 100th birthday, he threw a tiny private party at home in December 1995. He promised to see the guests at 101 and handed everyone cigars. He turned 100 on January 20, 1996. However, he passed away from cardiac arrest at home on March 9, 1996. However, less than 2 months after turning 100, George Burns passed away in his bed at his Beverly Hills residence this morning. The elderly comedian had recently been feeling better after being ill for some months. On October 10, 1996, his estate, worth over $30 million, went up for auction at Sue's in Beverly Hills. Scripts and cigars were among the $266 lots. He bequeathed everything to the Motion Picture Fund, United Jewish Fund, and Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Ronnie and Sandra got nothing. While some were taken aback, those who knew him realized that charity had been his last act of self-giving. His impact never diminished. Jerry Seinfeld has frequently claimed that George's book Living It Up influenced his comedic style. George's straight-man demeanor, quiet delivery, and exact timing created the foundation of contemporary comedy. His martinis and cigars became symbols, but doctors later claimed that his broad social network and keen intellect were what kept him alive.